So welcome everyone to our talk tonight. It's actually a bit of I guess it's a talk and a bit of sharing, I think. We've all been traumatised. We've been in the middle of a disaster, a horrible trauma. So tonight I'd like to talk about trauma, how we respond to trauma, I'll be talking mainly as a psychologist, talking about how we process trauma and how we can move beyond it. I'll be talking about acute stress syndrome and as well as post-traumatic stress syndrome. I'll also be talking about a little bit of the grief that we have. I mean, I know I'm experiencing a kind of collective grief for the loss of we've lost a town, a whole town, and villages and homes and so many things they're just, one day they were there and then the next day they're gone. And this is a great example of what the Buddha was teaching about when he talked about impermanence. It's just so stark. So when we experience a trauma, which is something that is, one way of defining a trauma is a life-threatening event. We either experience that life-threatening event ourselves or we witness a life-threatening event. Or we experience it vicariously. So there's a number of ways we experience trauma. And most of us, when we experience a trauma, we respond with fight, flight, or freeze. Polyvagal theory talks about ways we would cope, ways we've evolved to cope with different stressors and dangers and so on. And at the base level, back in our evolutionary history, we have the base level of freezing. It's like withdrawing, shutting off, closing down. Fainting, sometimes it could be understood as fainting. Playing possum, I think they call it. I don't know if they call that in Australia, or I guess it is, isn't it? It's pretend, yeah. But it is this kind of freeze response because that has survival value. And even, like, for example, you see a mouse freezes, sometimes we don't even see it moving. So it has a survival value. And if it's not a survival value, it's a way of us coping with the pain of the trauma. Like, often we'll dissociate in this kind of coping mechanism, which is a valid coping mechanism for dealing with danger. We will dissociate. We will just kind of get out of it. We may not even feel what's going on in our body. So we kind of withdraw. We shut down, we get out of there. And this is a valid way of coping. Unfortunately, it becomes sometimes it, well, not sometimes, but often it becomes not a very helpful way of coping with difficulty because we develop a disorder around it, or we develop it as a pattern of behaviour. So that's the freeze of the fight, flight, or freeze response. The next higher evolved response is the fight or flight response, which is basically a rush of adrenaline, cortisol, and we either get out of there or we stay and fight. We stand up to it, we go against it. And this is an enormous rush of adrenaline, and then with adrenaline, our heart rate increases, we might even evacuate our bowels, we might urinate, we might do all sorts of things that are related to increasing our efficiency to either run and escape the danger or to fight the danger. Heart rate increase, muscle tension, sweating in our palms or in our whole body, shaking. Shaking legs is a fear response. It's priming us to run. And with anger, what happens is we get more of a tension up in our upper body, like we'll feel our upper body tense up, ready to fight out. So again, there's a whole range of different things happen with this. We'll think quickly. There'll be thousands of thoughts going through our head in order to deal with the current situation. So I know I experienced this. I was in the top of the hill in Gerrards Hill, and we were closed off. We had become an island. I'm one of the lucky ones. I didn't have much damage to my house. There was a little bit of, water running down the hill, and it went under my house, and I had to get out in the middle of the night and dig under my house trenches so that the water wasn't going to go into the units downstairs and wear away the foundations and so on. But that was nothing. In the morning of I think Monday morning, or was it Monday morning, or was it Tuesday morning? It was Monday, wasn't it? Monday the 28th, is that right? Or Monday the 1st? Sorry. We went down the road, and the water was starting to fill up. Starting to go into our neighbours' yards, and already houses were beginning to submerge across the road. And I live close to the baseball fields, and it was a lake. It was more than a lake. The whole of the clubhouse was starting to reach up into its second level. Our markers from previous floods was kind of coming up our road, but it was really coming up. And one of the neighbours parked his car up a hill a little bit, and it was getting more and more submerged. It got completely submerged, whereas previous floods, it wouldn't even reach the tyres of that position. So, but I was speedy. I was running around thinking, what can I do? And I went down Dawson Street, and there you could see people being evacuated. People were drenched. It was still raining, drenched, being evacuated, being picked up. Sometimes some people had to leave their animals in their home. And a good news story is that this particular person, a friend of ours, they had to swim out of their top window, and then they held onto the gutters for about 40 minutes. And the current was so strong, their pants were being washed away. So they hung and had to leave their cat and dog in the middle of the house because they couldn't hold the cat or dog. And when we went and saw them, they're wringing wet. So and there was a number of other people coming in on little boats. This is just in Gerrards Hill. The eventual drop-off centre was up on Ballina Road, where they could be transported up to the evacuation centres. But these people were shocked. They were traumatised. The good news story about the person who left their animals behind, they went back 2 days later or a day later, when the floodwaters had begun to subside. They didn't go back. Somebody was paddling past, and they could hear a dog barking. And the dog was sitting on top of the mattress. It had floated to the ceiling, but he stayed on the mattress for, 36 hours or something like that. So that's a good news story. And the cat survived as well. So we went back the next day and we saw him. But look, I guess what I'm talking about is that when what happens with a traumatic response is that we become overwhelmed with ways of surviving and ways of dealing with it. So initially, as a psychologist, what we'll do is the initial response is called an acute stress response. Sometimes it's called, within the first month, it's called acute stress disorder. It's our acute way of responding. And after a month, it becomes post-traumatic stress disorder if these experiences happen. And sometimes the things that happen, well, not sometimes, often the things that happen are flashbacks about the trauma, is hypervigilance. Kind of hypervigilance is on the lookout for danger occurring again. Increased startle response. Anxiety or extreme distress or panic, sometimes, often panic, at reminders of the events. A kind of a distorted perception of the event. Sometimes we can't remember significant issues around the event. It's like we're cutting them out. And with post-traumatic stress disorder, it's sometimes diagnosed with anxiety, post-traumatic stress with anxiety, or post-traumatic stress with depression, or post-traumatic stress with anxiety and depression. So often what happens then is you start to realise the amount of loss, and that triggers a depressive response, like this grief, this sudden realisation that you've lost everything. I mean, I've lost nothing. My response to this was to just go down and sort out some clothes, give some clothes. We took out towels, and we had some chicken soup at home. So Mary cooked up this big pot of chicken soup, and she took it down to the people that were still in wet clothes. They're wringing wet, coming off the boats. These little canoes and whatever there was available. I had the thoughts of taking my own paddleboard out, and I thought, oh God, no way. I mean, I'd be more dangerous to anybody else. I wouldn't trust it. But anyway, so what happens neurologically with the trauma, and this is really interesting because it's good to understand this. Neurologically, what happens is our brain gets flooded with cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Adrenaline is like I think I'm not sure if it's the same or it's a kind of a variant of cortisol. Cortisol is the main stress hormone. Cortisol triggers us to, have a increased heart rate so we can, have the blood flowing around our body ready to fight or flight. It does a whole range of things which prepares us to deal with it. So, but what happens neurologically is that our amygdala learns that amygdala is the emotional amygdala, I think is the way you pronounce it. Amygdala is our emotional center of the brain. It gets kind of triggered to be highly sensitive to cues of trauma or stress, so we react. We get over emotional. We react to something instantaneously. Rather than thinking about it, there's a conditioned response. So we will react in an emotional way, whether it be fear or anger or anxiety or whatever. The other thing that happens, interestingly, is the hippocampus gets affected. The hippocampus apparently is where we keep our memories, where we store memories, the memories of the facts. Amygdala is the emotional center, and it's sets us up to be conditioned to respond to particular cues that will indicate there's danger in a way where we react before we even think about it. So it's there for our survival. The hippocampus is where we keep the facts, like the memories of things. And something that happens with the hippocampus in our normal memory development, is that we have this kind of stamp, a time stamp on our memories. The time stamp is like, where we used to take photographs, and you take a photograph and there used to be a time stamp on it, the date and the time. It's like that. So normally when we're normally functioning in a non-stressful environment, we'll have an accurate time stamp, and we'll have an accurate record of the event as a memory. However, what happens with a really stressful response is that the hippocampus is covered with cortisol receptor sites. So the cortisol goes in and it distorts the memory. It distorts the memory. It not only distorts the facts of the memory, so different things become associated with the trauma, like, well, it's not hard to think of rain falling on the roof. Normally that would be quite a calming, lovely sound, but it starts to associate, rain falling on the roof to flooding and trauma and disaster. So it also disturbs the time thing. So we get a kind of a disruption in our memory. It's just good to, and also, our thinking, our logical mind gets cut off. Our logical thinking mind gets put on hold because we're resourcing our amygdala and hippocampus and all the rest of it to respond. So this is what happens in a trauma. And the way we work with trauma, well, firstly I say it's kind of like with many traumas, we get stuck in those responses. We get caught up in those responses. And the ways of working with trauma, in my understanding, is firstly to deal with immediate coping responses, doing something immediately to deal with the situation. I've seen lots of traumatic people. I've seen people related to the floods too in the last couple of weeks. And I went to the evacuation centre when it was first started to rain, and I just said, look, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm here to serve. Tell me what to do. And they knew me from when I worked in community mental health, so they openly received me. And I saw quite a few people, not a lot of people, but I managed to talk to a number of people, and we talked about the trauma and how they can get over it. So initially, when I, as a psychologist helping someone with a trauma, I initially help them develop coping skills to deal with the negative experiences. And it's almost like training them to be able to shift their attention away from being caught up in the stories of trauma to something else. In fact, that's a real skill, and it helps to do that. Then later on, when they're ready in the trauma process, and this can take months, they're able to begin to process the events, like put them into a kind of a meaning. Because what happens with a trauma is often we're so overwhelmed by the reality of it, we just put it aside. We can't think about it. We just can't process it because it's so enormous. It just doesn't fit within our worldviews, and it doesn't fit within our way of understanding life. Once upon a time, we were coming home every day, go home and have dinner and watch TV, and then suddenly we have nothing to go home to anymore. There's something completely shocking. It's out of our worldview. So what I do as a trauma therapist, I'll eventually allow them to process these events. And in the processing of the events, the amygdala seems to become less sensitive. And also, the memories that are recorded, another way of thinking about memories that are recorded during a trauma is like taking a photograph, an electronic photograph, and it's kind of pixelated. It's a really not a very fine grain. Its pixels are not many, so that you get a distorted picture of the events. You're not quite seeing it clearly. So as we begin to process these events, the picture becomes more pixelated, more refined. It becomes clearer to what actually occurred. And in addition, the time frame starts to get placed. What we feel like when we're traumatized is as if the event's happening now all the time. We'll be reminded we'll hear the sound on the roof, and we'll suddenly be there, and our body's reacting as if it's happening again. So that's an error in the time frame. So when we start to process things, it reduces that error and corrects it. So that's a little bit about what happens neurologically. And so coming back to now how we deal with all this. And by the way, sorry, grief sets in. Grief. I mean, this is what I'm experiencing now. I'm experiencing, one of my clients talked about it as a collective grief. The whole of our town's disappeared. You know, there's no more CBD, and we don't know whether it's going to return or not. People have lost so many things, and so we're experiencing their grief as well. So there's a whole different thing with grief. The way we overcome grief is to be careful not to be caught up in ruminations. Be careful not to be caught up in mental fabrications, making it worse than what it is, and coming back to the reality of things and slowly and gradually accepting the reality of the loss. Then feeling the pain of the loss rather than denying it. Then kind of having a sense of closure about the loss, like an acceptance of that loss, and then getting on with life. This is the process of dealing with grief. So, coming back to dealing with trauma, it is about facing up to the memories that we put aside because we can't deal with it. Facing up to them, but in a context of feeling safe. Feeling safe. And something I didn't mention, I mentioned, these levels of coping with danger. First level is the basic level is to withdraw and faint or freeze or turn it off or shut it down or something like that. The second level is this fight or flight response, like fight it or run from it. The more recently evolved way of coping is through what we call social engagement, like connecting, through social connection. And this is where what I'm noticing in Lismore, what I'm noticing in our town, and the way people are moving through this trauma. It is about connecting, feeling like our back's covered. Feeling connection with something, and with that feeling, we feel safe. Now, and this is an essential component of overcoming trauma. It's an essential component of overcoming grief. And what I'm noticing in my clients and also the people I spoke to at the evacuation centre, I'm not going back there at the moment because I won't go into details, but I'm seeing my own clients now. But when I was talking to some people out of the evacuation centre, there was one gentleman I was talking to, and he'd lost his car and his house, and he had his dog, and he had his phone. That's all he had. And I was talking to him, and I was saying, well, he said, it's been a bit hard in this must have been 4 or 5 days. It must have been the Thursday I was speaking to him. He said, it's been, 3 days, and now it's all starting to catch up, And then he started to cry, he started to weep. And I said, is it because of the loss? He said, no, I'm weeping because so much kindness that I've experienced. People are generous, they're giving me everything, they're caring for me. And he had nothing, and he was crying in gratitude about this, the care that he was receiving. And every person I talked to, the same story. One woman I spoke to had been on a balcony over south, and she was watching the flood rise, and then she realised, hey, this is getting dangerous. on the first level of a building over there. And then she started to freak out. Then she saw a dinghy coming across, this dinghy, just some bloke in a dinghy, going against the current. You know what the current was like? It was treacherous. He manoeuvred up and he said, hop in, get in quickly now before the water gets so high that we have to go through these power lines. Because if he went through the power lines, his propeller would get tangled. So she said, as soon as she got in the dinghy, she felt okay. Even though it was treacherous, because someone was there helping. And she repeated the other thing is she said, that's what's helping me come through. She said it feels like a new beginning, and I feel so good because, not so good, but she feels buoyed because of the love and kindness that she's receiving. So this third way of coping is accessing our social connection, and it helps us feel safe. And I'm noticing that the healings in Lismore are coming about by people being able to talk about what's happening, being free to talk about it, which is one way of processing it. From a Buddhist perspective, you would say that talking about it or processing these events is by, rather than keeping them at bay, keeping them buried and because they're so overwhelming to look at, it is gradually and slowly turning our attention to them, to the gist of what's happening, to say what we do with mindfulness, what we do with insight meditation. We turn towards the experience and we see through it. And often what's happening is that we're caught up in thinking a lot about it. We're creating stories about it. In fact, when we're having flashbacks, which is one of the symptoms of trauma, we're kind of caught up in these images and these feeling responses that we feel like it's happening again now. But with mindfulness, we're slowly and courageously turning our attention to those issues, to that experience. We begin to realize that it's just a memory. It's not what's actually happening right now. What's happening right now is this situation. Mind you, to turn towards that experience effectively, one has to have the foundation of safety. One has to feel grounded and safe and like the quietude of serenity, but also from a Buddhist perspective, the supportive factors of the four heart qualities, the four divine abodes, loving kindness, warm benevolence, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity, supporting us to be able to go into and look at that which is quite painful. And then when we can actually settle into that, we can see through it. We can see it for what it is. It is just a memory. It's not, we correct the timestamp that's been put on it incorrectly because of distorted memories. And we actually find some peace. That was then, right now, I'm safe. Right now, it's okay. And that's the way we work with it. So, I'm talking more than I thought I would talk. Is it okay? Okay, so yes, we'll do something. Yeah, we'll do something. So there was one woman I was speaking to who was just overwhelmed with worry about the welfare of her children, and she couldn't get these images out of her head, and she was just kind of encapsulated in this worry. And this person had to evacuate in a dinghy and so on and so forth. So what I did with her is I talked to her a little bit, and that was okay. I mean, talking wasn't really doing much, but what I invited her to do was actually massage the tips of her fingers. not massage and rubbing them, but massage and press them quite firmly and tightly, like massaging the tips of her fingers. Because in acupuncture or in meridian theory, the tips of the fingers and the tips of the toes, at the side tips of them, not the very tips of them, but the sides of them, are where the meridian energies turn around, and they're quite powerful points to harmonize energies, like calm energies that are sort of circulating in the body. The other thing about them is they're quite intense experiences. They're calming, but they're strong experiences. They're easy to pay attention to. So, with this woman, she was thinking a lot, kind of caught up in her thoughts and bursting into tears and worrying and all the rest. So I invited her to massage her fingers and just pay attention to those, the tips of her fingers, and come into the moment doing that. And so we'll do this in a minute. And then after a while, she kind of went quiet. And she said to me, after a minute or two, she said, I can actually hear the environment. Her attention was so encapsulated with the traumas and the worries that she had failed to pay attention to what was actually going on right now. She said, I'm feeling a little bit calmer. I'm feeling calmer. So the next thing I did was I invited her to put her right hand under her belly button, the palm of her right hand under the belly button, and the palm of her left hand on top of her crown. And this might be, might not be validated in Western psychology, but as an energy, someone who worked with energy for many years, if you put your hands together like that, it's peaceful, because each hand has a different polarity, and they join and they sort of harmonize and balance each other. When you do this, you start to harmonize the chakras, believe it or not. It's got to be the palm of your hand, because there's a chakra on the palm of your hand. Then you go up to another chakra, you go up to another chakra, then you go to another chakra, the heart chakra. So I'll just describe this just in case someone's listening to this as an audio recording. One hand, your dominant hand just below your belly button, the palm of your hand, and your non-dominant hand at the top of the crown of your head. Then you move up the hand at the bottom to the solar plexus, keeping your other hand at the top. Then you move up your hand to your heart. And then you move the hand from the top of your head over the hand on your heart. And you just stay with that. And that activates your heart chakra, which is where we have a lot of neurons, but also where we experience benevolence, compassion, appreciative joy, and gratitude and peace. So in this way, she really calmed down. And I've been doing that with a lot of the people that have been thinking a lot and been caught up in worries and so on. And it works. It's really quite good. And sometimes we do a bit of tapping as well, but I won't be doing any tapping with you guys tonight. It's too much. So we've experienced a trauma, and I just want to mention two last things. That is something that I've experienced, and depending on other people with their circumstances, survivor guilt. Survivor guilt is when, I've got hill survivor guilt, because everyone around me has been inundated, and I'm okay. I think it's useful to acknowledge it and do what you can do. And the one last thing I want to say, you do what you can do. Another way of dealing with anxiety is to do something with purpose, do something purposeful. So I've noticed a lot of people are going out and helping people, and this is fantastic, because not only does it help them, it helps them understand that their backs are covered, but it also helps the individual who is helping, because they're having a direction and they're being altruistic and they're not thinking about themselves, and they're connecting with another. Okay, so thanks very much. I'll finish this little talk now, and let's have a bit of invite you to massage your fingers, and we can have a bit of a discussion.